Welcome back, everyone. We've gone over many things this past year, and I thank you for sticking with me. Welcome to Bamboo Studio, a powerful 3D slicer program based off of Prusa Slicer, which is based off of Slick 3R. Did you know the mundane act of opening and using the slicer actually is more important than you realize? You, yes, you have the power of creation, meaning you can right-click and create parts, bringing order to a blank 3D representative canvas. You have the ability to assemble two or more parts into a model. You can subtract parts, create holes with negatives. You can add text. You can enforce supports for structures that cannot print easily or at odd angles. You can block support to keep your 3D vision untouched by any other additional filament. You can meld parts together permanently or just take a slice where the parts met with mesh boolean. You can make changes to all of the parts on your build plate with the global process, or you can make individual changes to parts with the objects process. Now, what if there's a tool that bridges the gap of parts, negatives? Heck, what if there's a feature that bends the reality of global and objects process?
A wonderful, magical animal.
So we've covered creation, destruction, combination, separation, exclusion. Now we take on the most versatile tool in our arsenal, modification. Now the first thing we're going to look at is the global process, which basically means that all the parts that are on a build plate, so let's create this cube, the cylinder, and we will do a rounded rectangle, all follow the same rules. So that means that under our strength, we will have two walls. We will have a top surface pattern monotonic. We will have 5 top layers, 3 bottom layers, and the same infill. So we'll just do a quick slice. So all of these will follow the same rules that were set in the global process. So whether it be one item or 100 items, whatever fits on the build plate or any of the build plates, all fall under that. Now, continuing with that, we can go into objects process, which basically means that we can make individual changes. So if I were to take this cube here and go to, let's say, top layers, we'll remove those. And let's say for this cylinder, I want to change its infill. So we'll change the infill to a honeycomb. And let's say for the rounded cube, I don't want to see... Let's actually take out the wall loops. Now, if I were to slice this, each of these items would have different characteristics. So essentially no top. For this one, we changed the infill. And for this one, we removed the outer walls. Now, as it stands, this isn't too bad if you want to make a change to the entire model or entire part. So again, whether it's under global or under objects process, you can make an entire change for one particular part. Now, where we start running into issues if you have to make changes in several parts of the part. So let's say I take a different item and we will take I'll just do the rounded rectangle. All right. So again, this will follow the rules of the global process, which basically is the 2 wall loops. But let's say I wanted to make a change only on the top half of this. So if I were to right click on this guy, and if I go to height range modifier, actually before we go further, let's go to the actual height of that. The height of this, 25.6. All right, so I'm going to right click, go to height range modifier, and over on this side I can make adjustments to a certain part of it. So let's say I wanted the top half, so we know it will end in 25.6, and let's say from about we'll do 15. So from 15 to 25.6, we can set different characteristics. So from the previous one, we can make adjustments to things like layer height, the quality, the number of walls. But since we're right here, we're going to change it so we have fuzzy skin. So if I were to slice this, just the top part, or the part that was included within the height modifier, gets adjusted. So of course, same rules apply if I were to create that cylinder. And I wanted to make an adjustment here, height range modifier, and we'll just do it from the bottom and we'll go up 10. And I wanted something fancy, so if, let's say I wanted the infill density to be larger. So this is actually nice because let's say you have the base of a model and you needed it to be either sturdier or heavier, you can actually change some of the things like the infill or the number of walls. So if I were to just say make this 50 and we'll keep everything else the same, we'll slice the plate. So from here, we basically have a higher density when it comes to the infill. So height range modifier is kind of nice because you can just change certain parts of the model. Obviously, it could change on whatever height range you have. The only downside with the height range modifiers, you can only add one per model. So if I were to go into this one, so we already made it at the bottom, and if I right click and go to height range modifier, it's going to bring us to the same one. So just keep in mind, if you are going to use the height range modifier, that's its limitation. There is a way around it, and we'll go further into the video, and I'll show you how to do that. The next thing that we can do with our modifiers is essentially to create sort of like zones. So I'm going to start with a primitive. So we'll start with a cone, and we'll enlarge this. Now, there's few ways to add a modifier to a part. The first way is essentially to right-click on the item, and we'll say Add Modifier, and we'll pick a cube. The second way is essentially to right-click anywhere on your desktop or drag in an STL file. If we go, in this case, let's say Add a Primitive, and we'll do Rounded Rectangle. Now, this is a part, this is a modifier, but we can convert pretty much anything to a modifier, but we have to make sure it's merged or attached to your main part. So if we select both of these, right click and merge, it used to be called assemble, but it's just been renamed. I can then click on this item here. If I right click, I can change the type and make that a modifier. So the modifiers use the spot because they're yellow. Now, since these are not parts, if I were to go to slice, nothing happens. Also, if I were to have these overlap, nothing happens. Now, the reason why nothing happens is everything is still being controlled by the global process. So in order to actually make these modifiers do something, we have to select them. So let's say I selected the generic cube, which is this one, and we make some adjustments. So if I said, I don't want the wall loops, I don't want the top and bottom layer, and let's say I don't even want the infill, we can effectively turn that modifier here into a negative part. So it sort of just took a chunk out of this. So of course, the way this works is anything that overlaps the part, so anything on the outside doesn't do anything, but anything that overlaps gets controlled by the rules that you set up. So if I were to, let's say, change the color of this, so I just hit the 2 key, this section gets colored. And of course, I showed you this within another video, but if I were to add, let's say, text, so I can just add a part, actually click it, hit the T key or hit text, and we will say hello. And we want to have some sort of embedded section. Actually, make this horizontal so it follows the curvature. So we want to have some part of this embed within this, so we will have it embed 1 millimeter. Actually, let's do 2 millimeters. Now at the moment, this is still a part, so if I were to just slice, it hangs out on the outside. But if I were to select this text shape, again, right click, change the type into a modifier. And again, right now it's still being controlled by the global objects process, so if I were to hit slice, nothing happens. But if I were to color this, let's say make this black, and slice, we've now just made a flesh item along that cone. Now there are some limitations to the modifier. So the modifier, even though it's controlling this whole section here, there's things that you can't do with it. So even though I just showed you painting the entire item, I can't paint the modifier in the traditional way. So if I were to click on this, and if I go to the paint tool, that modifier doesn't give me an option to paint it. It'll paint the area that's touching, but it won't, you can't paint the modifier itself. All right, so as you can see, with the height range, we can control just a certain section of it, but when we're actually adding parts, we can create little overlapping zones, in which case we can set up rules. So again, you can set up, line width, layer height, strength. You could change how fast your printer goes on certain items. This is especially helpful if you had, let's say, a silk filament and you needed to slow down your printer in order to get sort of that sheen or shine on that particular area. So for instance, let's say I wanted to change how fast the hello printed. If I go to the text shape and I go to my speed settings, I can slow this down, especially if I'm using a silk filament. And again, I showed you fuzzy skin. So you can sort of play with this. So let's create a small model, and I can show you, we'll sort of combine everything I just showed you. Okay, let's see if we can actually make something with modifiers. We're going to start with something basic. We'll do the rounded rectangle. And don't need it too high, so 1 millimeter in height. And let's expand this out. And I can make adjustments to this later. All right, so one thing that we can do is let's actually, let's go under the different types of infill. So I will actually just create another rounded rectangle. And let's make a bunch of these. So we have under our rounded rectangle, how many infill patterns? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, 18. So we're going to clone this 18 times. So we have the 1, and then we'll just do 17. So there we go. And we're just going to adjust these. I'll do this 1, and then we'll start. All right, so I'll actually clean this up a bit. But in the meantime, let us select all these rounded rectangles, which is this, all the way to this. And we're just going to make them a different color so we can spot them a little bit easier. All right, so we would then actually combine all of these. And I'll readjust some of this to make it even. But we're going to select them all. And we're going to right click and merge them all as one item. Cool. And I'm just going to convert all of these into a modifier. let's make some adjustments. So we can select on each of these, and we will go to strength, and actually don't want any top layers. And bottom layers, yeah, we can leave that at 2, which is fine. And we can start making adjustments. So for instance, if I were to make this concentric and slice, you'll see that became concentric. And we're just going to go through each of these and just make adjustments. So we'll go back to prepare. And you know what? Make this 25. You want to notice it. And I'm just going to go through each of these. All right, so I decided to add some text to this so we can see how this looks. And the text is sticking out, so let's make that flush as well. And that should just be as simple as selecting our text items, and we can make that to, let's go here. As modifiers. So each of these I'm just going to make as a modifier, and then we're going to color those. All right, so I decided to play with a little bit more in terms of colors. And as I was doing this, I was actually making revisions and making clones and copies. But nice part about our modifiers, so unless it's touching the build plate, it doesn't exist. So as it's touching the build plate here, it will then obviously pick whatever rules we've set up. I also moved each of these up slightly. So when I go to preview, instead of it penetrating through the entire model, I moved it up about 2 layers. So if we go down, it doesn't just put the infill at the bottom, but it needs something to build off of. All right, so let's print this out and see how it looks. That was a quick look at the modifier tool. I haven't done it justice in the amount of applications it can be used in, but hopefully this brief overview can be helpful in your projects. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or recommendations, please leave them below.